We've dropped our recession probability this year from 40% 3 months ago down to 25%.
Of important breaking news. Let's start out with our first look at fourth quarter GDP. Expected to be up 2%, buckle up 3.3%.
I think we can safely say, Kira, that the economy is out of the woods when it comes to a recession.
Last year, the media, economists, CEOs, and consumers were sounding the alarms on what was to be a 2023 recession. With high interest rates, skyrocketing inflation, and consumer spending propped up by COVID-19 stimulus, it seemed all but guaranteed that a recession was on the cusp of rocking in the United States economy. And as a result, many people, including myself, spent 2022 and 2023 waiting for a housing market, a car market crash, waiting for defaults, repossessions, and foreclosures to impact everyday consumers at a growing rate, and yet it never happened. And now as we sit here in 2024, those same people that predicted a recession in 2023 are saying that we may have actually avoided one altogether. But there is evidence to suggest that while consumer spending is still strong, GDP did grow, and we did avoid a recession in 2023, we are actually far from out of the woods. Because whenever we look at the data, there is actually evidence to suggest that a growing GDP and strong consumer spending is actually a facade that's being propped up by consumer debt. Consumer loans consisting of credit cards, auto loans, and of course large home mortgages and student loan balances. The reality is the US has a debt problem, and this is going to become a major issue. In fact, it already is. But before we dive into that, let's first take a look as to why we didn't end up having a recession in 2023. Whenever we look at a recession, it's really caused by, or at least exacerbated by, three things: people losing their jobs, consumers spending less money, or companies losing profits. And these three things are incredibly interconnected. People lose their jobs because companies are making less money. People spend less money because they lost their job, and thus companies lose profit, and then even more people get laid off. It really does become a vicious cycle. And sure, I can already see a lot of people in the comments saying,
recessions are caused by a lot more than just these three things.
And there certainly is more nuance to take into account. Things like inflation, deflation, the stock market, foreign affairs. You get the point. What I'm trying to say is that if these three things are healthy, so low unemployment, high consumer spending, and high corporate profits, it can prevent a recession from happening at all. And that's exactly what has been happening. Because while I know people have been affected by unemployment, particularly in the tech sector, unemployment is very low, at least historically speaking, and while corporate profits are down, they are still very, very high. And despite inflation and high cost of living, people are still spending a lot of money. And this is where the United States debt problem comes into play. There is a growing belief, and this is something that I've been banging the drum on for about a year now, that while consumer spending is in fact up, it's actually being propped up by growing consumer debt. JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon was quoted in a Business Insider article in Q4 of last year saying that the US consumer is addicted to debt and that this is giving the US economy a sugar high. And I truly believe that this phrase right here perfectly explains the situation that we're in. In 2020 and 2021, during the pandemic, US consumers saw financial stimulus totaling $1.8 trillion. And while not all of this money was in actual cash, it was in either cash or stimulus programs that resulted in more cash in consumers' pockets. This money was designed to not only keep people afloat, but to also keep consumers spending money. And while absolutely this money was spent on necessities, things like food, mortgages, transportation, utilities. But because of student loan pauses, foreclosures, and loan delinquency pauses, a lot of people also spent this money on non-essentials as well, because this money gave consumers more disposable income than they've had in the past. And according to reports, consumers spent this money on wants, things like appliances, motor vehicles, and recreational goods. On top of consumer spending increasing, households also saved more money than usual during this period of time, with personal savings rates reaching an all-time high. But the problem is, and I quote Jamie Dimon, is that this consumer spending has given the US economy a sugar high. Over the last few years, consumers have become accustomed to spending money. Whether that spending is a want, a need, or both, it doesn't really matter. The point is, consumers are getting used to spending a lot of it. And as I mentioned earlier, in 2020 and 2021, this spending was supported by loan forbearance, loan forgiveness, and stimulus. But as we headed into 2022 and 2023, this spending was supported by debt and personal savings. In a report filed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, it was stated that not only the amount of money that we are saving, but the amount that we have in savings is declining. The historical pre-pandemic savings rate for the average American prior to the pandemic was 6.2%. but in recent years, it's been closer to 5%. And the interesting thing is that depending on the lens that you look at this through, a personal savings rate of 5% is either just bad or it's really bad. You see, the pre-pandemic savings rate was 6.2%, but there is an argument to be made that while the pre-pandemic savings rate was 6.2% and today's saving rate is 5%, consumers actually shouldn't be only saving 6.2%, and they should actually be saving closer to 10% to account for inflation and higher cost of living. Which means that if we're basing personal savings expectations off of the fixed 6.2% that we've historically seen, we're saving 1.2% less than we really should be, as you can see from the graph on the right. But if you believe that this rate is variable and we should be saving more to adjust for inflation, then we should actually be saving closer to 10%, which means that we're saving 5% less or 50% lower than we should be, which is depicted on the graph on the left. But the problem isn't just that we aren't saving enough, it's also that we're depleting the savings that we have. With the amount of cumulative personal savings at the lowest amount that we've seen since 2018. But truthfully, this really only paints half of the picture because the other part of the story makes it much, much worse. In a report just released by the Federal Reserve last week, household debt in the United States has reached a record $17.5 trillion, with delinquency rates across the board rising as well. Credit card balances increased by $50 billion or 4.6%. Auto loans increased by $12 billion. Other balances, which include retail cards or other consumer loans, increased by $25 billion, and student loans have reached $1.6 trillion. You can also see the breakdown of debt here, with mortgages making up a large portion of loans, and then student loans making up a shockingly large portion as well. You can see how the number of accounts have grown. This is the actual number of accounts, not necessarily the dollar amount of debt within them, with auto loans actually declining, mortgages flat, and credit cards rapidly growing. The point is, Americans are taking out a ton of debt, and they are beginning to fall behind because according to the same report by the Federal Reserve, delinquency status of debt is increasing. You can see here, for example, green represents 30 days late, and we've seen a pretty big uptick of this in the last couple of quarters. This is total debt. If we look at a breakdown of accounts that are 90-day plus delinquents, credit cards have seen the largest increase, and we see that roughly 10% of credit cards are 90-plus day delinquent. This is roughly a 2.5% increase. And when we look at 30-plus day delinquent loans, so loans that people are just now falling behind on, this is even worse, with auto loans and credit cards seeing a large jump post-pandemic. And it's important to point out that all of this is whenever student loans are at a record low delinquency rate, which certainly is not going to be the case forever. While number of people with collection accounts is the lowest it's been in decades, the amount in collections is higher than we've ever seen. And one of the most concerning trends here is the age group that these debts are affecting, with millennials and Gen Zs falling behind at a much faster rate than older generations. This is also the group of people that are benefiting the most from low student loan delinquencies. During the pandemic, stimulus, which led to an increase in consumer spending as well as government programs, kept the economy afloat. Then in 2021 and 2022, recession fears kicked back up again, but stimulus money continued to keep the economy afloat. And like I mentioned earlier, in 2023, whenever stimulus money actually did run dry, a recession was almost a sure thing. But as it turned out, consumers used debt, credit cards, and personal savings to keep their spending afloat, and once again, this kept the economy out of a recession. And while some news anchors, CEOs, and analysts believe that we are out of the woods when it comes to a recession because of this strong consumer spending, we have to ask ourselves the question of what happens whenever these credit card lines run out, when the personal savings is gone, and collection letters start piling up on the kitchen table. This debt situation, U.S. spending, it is simply unsustainable. And this spans from home mortgage debt, auto loan debt, credit card debt, and of course student loan debt as well. And once the foundation of the U.S. economy, which was built on personal savings declining and credit card debt increasing, once this foundation begins to crack, well, that's whenever the real economic crash will begin. But like always, you guys, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, comments, if you have anything to add, I would love to hear it, so make sure to leave a comment down below. And while you guys are at it, make sure to hit the like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell, and I will see you guys in the next video.